Of course, it's one of the advantages of coming sort of a little bit later in the programme to be able to sort of pick up on various points that people have made so far. But it's also a disadvantage because you might want to sort of skip several slides to avoid duplication of effort. So I'll try and pace myself accordingly and perhaps trot through some of the early slides so that we can go through some of the arguments indeed for widening therapeutic access or expected therapeutic access beyond the standard placebo only controlled randomized trials, you know, quite thoroughly, because there are very distinct approaches, and it's important that we're clear about what justifies exactly what sort of approach, and all have limits. And in conclusion, I think we'll find that this is still work in progress. So I'm hopeful that you're up for plenty of discussion as we go through. So this is an attempt to reconcile the individual and collective interests during epidemics of the sort that we're now facing, emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. And as you know, we're really quite experienced in Africa, most notably with the West African Ebola outbreak. But now facing this pandemic, there are further concerns, perhaps from other interests that we'll go on to discuss. So without wanting to duplicate Jeremy's wonderful slide, of course, there's a vast amount of research going on now. We've got WHO's R&D blueprint, where they're trying to prioritise and outline all the different rationales for doing what kinds of research. And they have working groups, not only for therapeutics and vaccines, but now for ethics and for social sciences research. So they're attempting to be all-encompassing and to have some sort of coordinated effort in every area, but we'll see what limits there are to that as we go through. Oopsie. Sorry, I seem to have.
Is everything okay?
Yes, I've just. Can you see my slide okay there?
I can see your slide. I can see your for COVID.
Hit the hyperlink there. I'm using a Mac for the first time, so do forgive me.
Good luck with that. I gave it up.
Okay, so let us cast our minds back only a few months. It seems almost a lifetime ago, but you'll remember from the early conversations at WHO in February, there were, when looking at what types of research they were wanting to prioritise. And for the moment, I'm going to restrict to therapeutics and vaccine studies. You'll remember that there was a huge emphasis, and this was from governments, most notably across Europe and in the States, on supplying what was assumed to be what was going to be under shortest and most demanding supply, and that is mechanical ventilation. So sort of bread and butter of intensive care. Now it's interesting that for the intensivists, who were initially at least front and centre of the outbreak responses in the UK at least, and it'd be interesting to hear how things panned out elsewhere. They were very keen to set up, you know, extra field hospitals of intensive care units with many more ventilators, mechanical ventilators of the sort that we all know about. Yet at no time was it suggested that that we do a clinical trial of those ventilators, particularly a randomized controlled trial. That just was never a suggested research study. Yet, of course, we've now got before and after data on survival rates to suggest that other kinds of delivery of oxygen could be more beneficial and less harmful than the standard intensive care mechanical ventilation. We've got an acronym CPAP, which I think it's like a balloon that forces oxygen into the lungs. And of course, it's to try and treat hypoxia, not breathlessness per se, that can be caused by any number of other things, but it's the low oxygen saturation that has become a source of huge concern. So that's starting with that. It's interesting as we've seen and got a better understanding of the natural course of the disease. And I'm not quite sure what counts as the disease and what now counts as a complication of the disease. Certainly secondary infections by bacteria, and we know from autopsy studies that is quite high among people who have died. There is increasing attention on targeting, rather than the virus itself with antivirals, either to stop infection in the first place or indeed to try and reduce the virulence or how well it can replicate in the body and in different areas of the body. So not only the lungs, but the heart. The receptors for the virus are apparently all over. So it can get in the brain, can get in the heart, you name it. But for the symptoms of severe disease, where you've got, blood clotting or hyperinflammation, there are, certain treatments that have been repurposed, if you like. And this is one of the clear lines of attack that has got everybody both interested and exercised about. But what's interesting to note is how science works. And having been working more closely with philosophers of science, not so much historians, it's interesting that for at least the repurposed drugs that can be informed by different specialties, we've got hypotheses that are driven far more by clinicians than by the guys at WHO, who seeing from biological mechanisms de novo how something might be expected to work and would need to be evaluated in due course. So that really leads to what I think Michael was talking about initially, was this apparent paradox between the need for gathering evidence of both safety and efficacy, and strong evidence, at the same time as ensuring that our current patients who are faced with severe disease don't all die. So the delay of providing access to a therapy which may or may not work, I mean, who knows initially, that delay in and of itself might have irreversible and catastrophic effects, consequences on the course of life and death. So whether COVID presents an exact paradox is up for discussion. We know that the case fatality rates, and we're getting an idea of prevalence. So we've got a better idea of the denominator here. And it seems that the case fatality rates are actually, remarkably small, if higher than we would expect for seasonal flu. And what is of concern here, at least in the UK, is the numerator, the number of severe cases which would be hospitalised, and how we can maintain the need for hospitalised care within the capacity that we currently have or can achieve in rapid fashion. So that's how the limits to what research we try and get off the ground, and why we're so exercised about the case fatality rates is because of the hospital capacity, and everything else seems to be hinged on exactly that. So, so precaution could be somewhat self-defeating, if not paradoxical. In this case, you'd have to have a disease that had a very high fatality rate for it to become entirely self-defeating, but it still creates a burning need to redress the balance between the perceived needs of current patients, so that's both for each individual, as well as the cohort of patients with severe disease needing hospitalisation, and trying to either prevent that or treat once presented, as well as future patients. Of course, our classic tension in research ethics is often couched in terms of an individual versus, very often, future patients. Here in an epidemic, we've got a third class, a third group, which is the cohort of current patients. So there are strong reasons to widen access, but of course it's not by category. It's a question of to what extent we would have reason to widen access beyond what we traditionally would see as restricting access to a placebo-only randomized controlled trial and all the various phases in the traditional sort of pathway to a market license. Now, just casting your mind back, please, a little bit further, back to the West African outbreak, and just reminding ourselves of what sorts of debates were going on then. It was interesting to see that the outbreak, you'll remember, was contained ultimately by a social intervention and not by technology. So yes, we now have what we know to be an effective vaccine, particularly the one manufactured by Merck, and there are monoclonal antibodies for which there are good evidence to treat Ebola. But during that one outbreak, there were reviews into, you know, what we could learn scientifically, ready for the next. And it was thought that really we didn't have much to go on, either because the outbreak had dwindled before we could get the statistical power up to an adequate degree, or because the studies were designed so that it was claimed we couldn't make a definitive inference about cause and effect. And again, you'll remember the US Academy of Sciences report into how to integrate research into an outbreak response. The upshot of that was it was recommended we prioritise as few candidates as possible in order to be able to concentrate our efforts on getting a definitive result, definitive scientific result, apparently as efficiently as was possible during the same outbreak. And that would be through, you've guessed it, a placebo-controlled, a placebo-only controlled, randomised controlled trial. And I'll put the link up to the report. I mean, you'll all be very familiar with it, I'm sure. But of course, that recommendation leads to a very narrow way of thinking. We still need to prioritise, and this is what some researchers were trying to do at the time of the West African outbreak, to prioritise or to screen many different therapeutics in order to pick up what might have a large effect size quickly. Yes, there are going to be therapeutics which could offer modest effect sizes. And yes, we might need large randomized controlled trials in order to be able to detect those. but it's a fundamental question of philosophy. Which trade-offs are you going to make, and when? Are you going to sort of go for broke and try and find something with a large possible effect size, which you could pick up without needing to do a highly resourced, big randomized controlled trial? Or are you going to sort of start out thinking, well, if we get anything with a modest effect size, we'll just be grateful for that? So at the other extreme, we've got what's often called compassionate access. And this comes from, well, analysis of resource allocation and health economists trying to judge when individuals who are regarded as exceptional cases could be excused for having more expensive treatments than we think might be cost effective for a population at large. And this is where sort of compassionate access has really sort of come from. And it's often used on the back, as we've heard earlier, of expanded access, but in order to really protect the science as it is thought, it's only those ineligible for ongoing trials or for whom there aren't any trials, say for rare conditions, rare diseases, compassionate access might be a way to go. Though conceptually, it's really difficult because we're not talking about individual patients at exceptional need. We're talking about a whole cohort of patients who are in clinical need now, as well as how we gather robust enough scientific evidence to inform future practice and the next cohort of patients in 2 weeks, in a month, in 6 months. In the UK, at least, there is no legal rider attached to compassionate access for named individuals. So we've seen several legal cases before now where a patient has been able to refuse for their data to be processed for the scientific community to learn from each individual case in aggregate. So there's some legal work to be done in the UK, and I'll be coming on to how we might conceive of, as Shlomo was talking earlier, the new category, Murray, which was born of the West African Ebola outbreak, and how that might pan out now. So just a quick note, compassionate access was strongly discouraged in the UK very early on, even for repurposed treatments to treat symptoms as well as to try and target the virus. And this came into sharp focus with tocilizumab, which is a drug that is routinely prescribed for rheumatoid arthritis and is thought to dampen down a hyperinflammatic response as we're beginning to see with severe COVID. And it was very early on that we didn't even recognise hyperinflammation as being a syndrome. We might call it a complication, we might call it a particular type of COVID, but suffice it to say, it was only very rarely that a compassionate access had been set up, on which basis a case series could be reported. And that was even when clinical trials weren't available, so it wasn't necessarily competing directly for patients. I should say, though, that we do now have clinical trial data suggesting that there's no significant benefit to its use after all. So that just goes to illustrate how you can learn from sort of multiple areas. And of course, the trial was done with select centres which didn't have compassionate access programmes. So coming to the first argument, or the first approach that we might make for ensuring the balance between individual and collective interests is the right one. And of course, the standard way of balancing is through appealing to the concept of equipoise. This is often a little bit convoluted, and itself can refer to the profession as a whole, in which case we might think, well, that could justify any research we want to do until we have the results from the research that's being justified through the concept of equipoise itself. Now, I've been having a bit of toing and froing over how relevant this concept is with colleagues in the States. It's often thought that to appeal to personal preference at all is to assume that a particular therapy is both safe and effective. And that of itself will justify randomly allocating those patients to the therapy, because a preference is either irrational or it's a private preference that has no relevance for research. Now that's not true, in the sense that if you're comparing something you know won't work, nothing at all, or you've got a survival rate attached to best current standards of care, and you're offering something in addition to or instead of that best possible standard of care, which has a chance of being better, but it also has a chance of being worse, you recognise that it could still be rational to want to make those trade-offs. To the point about it being catering for private interests and private preferences, well, this is where we have to show that research isn't, and to benefit from those data, isn't just a case of appealing to a false dichotomy, if you like. Either you enter a large randomized controlled trial for definitive yet internally valid results, or you have individual access, compassionate access, with no use of data for us to learn from. Though that is a false dichotomy. So we have to make access itself, if indeed we're going to make compassionate access itself more compatible with the scientific endeavours, to ensure that we're not just pandering to private interests, by recognising that a preference for a treatment is rational and worth respecting. The second approach is to look at innovative trial designs. I know we've picked up on trial design, and yes, we would want to ensure that it's sound, we can learn from it, we can make useful inferences. The convention, of course, is a placebo-controlled randomized trial, randomizing in ratios of 1:1. Following the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, we've got all sorts of permutations and combinations, all of which we think we can learn something from.
Sarah, you have 2 more minutes.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to rattle through then. So there's still a tension here. Looking at Murray, we've got then a way of extending the emergency use conditional on learning from the routine use. If we know something is likely to have a large effect size, and if we're gathering large real-world data sets, we should be able to pick up patterns of effect and infer quite robustly cause and effect without needing to go to randomized trials. The last approach, the one that I favour, is a pluralistic approach, where we have a sort of programme of work and different sources and levels of evidence can be examined in the round, so that we get a sense of how we can generalize from clinical trials. We have real world data that is running in parallel rather than as a sequential implementation or pragmatic study later on. We also have different interventions. Some aren't going to do any harm, and for which we might not need really, really robust evidence. The kind of, well, why not? And that's with the face masks and the use of aspirin as an anticoagulant. Aspirin's particularly pertinent here because, of course, we never did have RCT evidence that aspirin worked. Yet it does seem in this study, at least before and after, to have a tangible effect on survival rates. And by being more pluralistic, we can try and make research generally more resilient. We're not pinning all our eggs, we're not putting all our eggs in one basket. We're trying to address the replication of science crisis that we know to be rife. Fraud also is rife in medical science, but it remains questionable how we should coordinate and regulate this. We want to avoid having a free-for-all. We want to avoid everything being top-down, because that really crowds out generating hypotheses at the bedside. But we also want to avoid having an entirely liberal approach where it is just a free-for-all and nobody can really learn from everything else because we're just overwhelmed. So I think that that's a rapid rush to the conclusion. This is the work in progress, which is how to get that balance now, rather than between the individual, our current patients and future patients, but how we can coordinate collective efforts so that we plug in gaps epistemologically, and we can govern our research so that we better balance what's a clear case for widening therapeutic access to new therapeutics.